So good evening. My name is Mariel Martin, and I'm the director of Norman Cultural Connection. And we're delighted to be the host for this special event this evening. Thank you for coming and helping us honor our special guest, Tukin Jimpa. Thank you.
Good evening. First of all, I would like to thank Mariel for introducing me and welcoming me here and the Norman Cultural Connection. I love that title. I hope, I feel a little humbled by the turnout, and I hope you haven't mistaken thinking that the Dalai Lama is going to be here. I feel very touched that clearly the topic of my book, Compassion, has spoken to you in your own way. And, we were driving up. My friend Ashish was here, who very graciously, offered to drive me up. I've been on a mainly two-city tour of Birmingham and Dallas. And, I've been trying to come here. I was supposed to come in May last year, but it didn't work out. And then we found out that actually Norman, Oklahoma is at a driving distance from Dallas. And I've promised Ashish that I will come to Dallas. So I said, let's combine the two together, and it worked out beautifully. So Ashish drove me up, and tomorrow after breakfast, we're going to drive back. I have 2 days programs in Dallas. So I'm really happy that I've been able to do this, and I also feel very touched that a group of you from here have been reading my book. Very happy that the book is available outside, and also very happy to know that there are some Tibetan students at the Oklahoma University. This is my first time in Oklahoma. I've never been here. The only association I have with Oklahoma is that the musical. You remember that? There was a nice song in it, and I remember seeing it quite early when I was much younger. So it's really nice to be here, in person now. What I would like to do is to say a few things about compassion first, and then at the end, if it is possible with the mic, I would like to have a more extended question and answer period, so that if you have any particular question, it need not necessarily be related to my book. Any question that you may have, and if I don't know the answer, I'll be just frank and say I don't have a clue. So I think it would be nice to have that interaction, because I, personally find Q&A session very meaningful to myself. So that it's not just a one-way communication. In the process, I too can learn something. And generally, the question and answer experience is very educational for myself as a speaker. And I'm particularly happy to have this evening session here in this beautiful place of worship. Just the space and the ceiling, it's pretty impressive. And I know that in America, spirituality in general, and particularly the Christian faith, is very, very important in many people's lives. So I'm sure that the people who have gathered here represent different backgrounds, and probably majority from the Christian faith, and which is also quite kind of meaningful to me to know that the language of compassion speaks to you as well. And if you think about it, it shouldn't be surprising, because compassion is really at the core of the ethical teachings of all the major world religions. The world's different religious traditions may differ on the specifics of dogma, creed, mythology of the origins of the universe, and their own faith traditions, and so on. But when it comes to the practical instructions on how to live a good life, a meaningful life, pretty much the prescriptions tend to be similar. Don't harm others, be good to others, basically, my own understanding is that the heart of the question of ethics is simply this: how do I treat the person in front of me? How do I treat my fellow human being? That is the central question of ethics. And the response all the major religious traditions have given to this question is just like you yourself want to be treated by the other person. That, in a nutshell, is the essence of the idea of compassion. Compassion is an idea as well as a value that really reminds to us as individuals there are other people other than you, so that the world just does not revolve around you alone. And just like you wish to be happy and do not want suffering, other person are exactly the same. So each of us, up to a point, we cannot completely escape the prison of our narrow concept, because we're all embodied individuals, and our bodies are bounded. We are not merged, which means there is going to be a separate individual identity for all of us. And our experience of the world and our perception of the world is going to be from that standpoint. That is an unavoidable reality of human experience. But at the same time, if you think that that perspective, that experience and that standpoint alone is the reality of the world, then you're going to run into trouble, because you're going to have a clash. Because imagine the world filled with these individuals who are trying to jostle position in this world. You have a problem. So therefore, all the spiritual teachings of the world try to explain to us how should we see ourselves, and how should we see our fellow human beings, and on that basis, how do we treat our fellow human beings. And therefore, the foundation of the moral teachings of all the faith traditions, as well as humanistic traditions, the good ones, are really this golden rule. Now, the difference today is now, up until now, the proponents of compassion and the compassion-based moral teachings and ethics has been predominantly from the religious voice. And we have historically and traditionally, the teachings on compassion has been tied up to a particular religious discourse, and depending on whether you're coming from the Buddhist world or a Hindu world or Christian world, most of the teachings on compassion has been somehow embedded within the framework of a particular spirituality. And that is understandable, because that's the language we understood. And historically, many of these societies were kind of fairly autonomous. There was kind of more homogeneous kind of, not only ethnicity-wise, but also in terms of worldview and religious kind of, traditions as well. Except for places like India. India has been for thousands of years a pluralistic, place when it comes to spiritual traditions. Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, Samkhya traditions, many of these multiplicity of religions have been homegrown tradition in India, but outside India, most of the cultures have been pretty homogeneous. So within that, cultural context, of course, the moral teachings are going to be couched and framed in that particular culture-specific language. But we shouldn't confuse, because that is the historical reality, that we cannot take it out of that and develop a more universally approachable language. Now, this is where today's reality is interesting, because if you look at the world, most of the Western world, particularly, are very pluralistic. It's a multicultural world, and also, the domains that used to be the special purview of religion is now opened up. So, for example, like today, science is a major player in this domain, and science is beginning to look at issues that has to do with mind and body, not just about from a medical point of view, but also from a mental well-being point of view. And increasingly, science is looking at something like compassion. And that was one of the things that I was trying to bring in my book. How is the discourse, scientific discourse on compassion is going to help us appreciate the universality of values like compassion and to make it more real. And for people who are not religious, when science is able to say something, the phenomena becomes real. I mean, that's the world that we are living in. In a sense, science has a certain credibility and authority, but in any case, one thing that science does bring is a language that is more universal. The scientific language is not tied to any specific culture. Therefore, science coming into the discussion of compassion, from my point of view, is a good thing. And another thing is that science is obsessed with evidence. So science is not happy with saying, oh, you should be kind, don't be selfish. That kind of, moralizing is something that science is not happy. They would want proof. They would want evidence. Why should I be compassionate? So now research shows, first of all, compassion is very fundamental to who we are as human beings. It's not something that we come to learn either from religion or from our parents. Compassion, the seed for compassion, the potential for compassion, the impulse for compassion is actually inborn. It's not something that somehow later, civilizing influence from the society teaches us. And how do we know this? Children as young as 4 to 5 months old, pre-language kids, they display a preference towards a helping behavior versus hindering behavior. There are some very cute experiments that have been done, and I keep referring to this particular experiment, which was done at the Yale Center for Infant Cognition. And I've referred to that in my book. And it involves children being brought into this center with their mother and sitting on the mother's lap. And then they are exposed to a video. And the video has a kind of a slope. And one object, which is like square or round thing, but it's animated with eyes and stuff. And it's trying to climb up. And in one set of experiments, as it tries to climb up, another object, it then falls down and it's not able to climb up. And then another object comes from the back and pushes it and helps it to get over the hump. Another set of experiments, it's the same image, but this time the object is on the top. So every time this object tries to climb up and just about to get there, it knocks it down. And after the experiments, when the children are given the choice to choose a toy, they always choose the helping toy. Now, they tried everything. They think it could be the color, but they changed the color. It could be the shape. Doesn't matter. It's the helping toy, the children's. Now, it shows that as early as 4 months old, children have the ability to recognize what is a helping behavior and what is a hindering behavior. There's a natural preference towards that. Now, at age 14 months, children then show spontaneous helping behavior. Now, they can now run around, they can walk. And this has been tried in a Max Planck Institute, a German university, science center. And they have done this multiple times. And children, even if they're engrossed in a game that they're playing or a play, if they see an adult struggling and then they show this, a person is trying to dry a clothesline, something on a clothesline, and then drops a peg and can't reach it down and doesn't want to let go and is struggling to get it. A child, 14-month-old child, sees this, just gets up, first looks around and tries to see if the guy can get it. And if he can't, the child gets up, leaves the play, and helps. So this spontaneous helping behavior. Now, furthermore, now the scientists are interested. So, okay, how far can we push? Now, if the children as young as 4 months old show this kind of tendency, can we find this in non-human primates who are supposed to be our cousins? They find it. In non-human primates, there are some cute videos on the YouTube there's apes fighting, two juvenile apes fight, and one loses the fight very badly. Another juvenile ape, who's a friend of the one who lost the fight, comes around and consoles it by giving an arm around. Now, consolation is a very complicated, complex emotion. Consolation presupposes that you understand what just happened. So there's indication of an empathy and also the need to comfort. Now, that is a complex psychological process. Now, if non-human primates can display this, this shows how deep the evolution, let alone religion, even from a purely scientific point of view, how deep the impulse for empathy is embedded in our brain. So all of this shows that this is a very natural part of who we are, and it makes perfect sense because I would argue because those who have been parents know that, I have two daughters, now they're much older. One is 21 and the other one is going to be turning 19 soon. But because because of the background in Buddhist philosophy and psychology as a monk, and then having studied philosophy at Cambridge and science, having had the opportunity to serve His Holiness in numerous science dialogues, I've been very interested. I see myself as a student of human kind of, behavior. I was curious as a father to see, the child's mental development. And it was amazing. The one thing that amazed me was how long it takes for the young infant to be able to say, I want this. Until, language comes, around month 11, 12, around 1.5, 2, and they start speaking, but initially when they start talking about their needs, they actually refers to themselves in third person. If you have noticed this, they will say, Kandu wants that, Tara wants this, and then at some point it clicks them to say, I want this. So this notion of who I am as an individual doesn't seem to be there right at the beginning. Right at the beginning, I would argue this child's sense of self is very relational. It's very tied to the interaction with them, particularly with the mother. So our deep level of our sense of existence really is very relational. It's, and it makes perfect sense because among the species, human beings are the ones who, need longest amount of, kind of nurturing from the mother. It takes long time. The child doesn't start walking until 9 months or 10 months or 11 months. So you're totally at the mercy of someone in front of you, and that process has to leave a powerful impression in our mind. That's the experience. And the earliest experience is the experience of total dependence and affection from someone. And that is what shapes us as individuals. Of course, as we grow older, and particularly in the West, and especially in North America, we value independence and autonomy so much. We start thinking that, we don't need others. Sort of this idea of independence and autonomy is such an important cultural value, particularly in America, actually. If you have a cultural war going on, any side who can come up with an argument that this violates individual freedom has almost like a kind of a knocking down punch there. So that we value in North America the idea of individual independence so much. So as we grow older, we forget our basic reality of that interconnectedness and dependence, and and as adults, we kind of know if we look at our own experience. To a large extent, of course, there are, whether you have a job or not, whether you are successful at school or not, there are many other external conditions that contribute to our happiness or suffering. That's a fact. We are material, physical beings. We have physical and material needs. But once those basic needs are met, a large part of our experience of happiness and suffering is really determined by the quality of our relationship with those in our lives and those at our work colleagues. And that really, and we as human beings, we have the ability to look back, remember things, and we have the ability to look forward and anticipate and project things to the future. And that's what makes human species very different from animals. Animals are much more present oriented, and if they have a full belly and kind of there's no threat around, they're kind of happy. Human beings are more complicated than that. So we have the ability to project back and in the future. So often, whatever interaction we have with others, not only the present experience affects, but also present experience reminds things that have happened in the past, and we add on to the experience by interpreting, all sorts of things, and that's who we are. So in our day-to-day life, the reason why, the quality of our experience of happiness and suffering is defined by the quality of our relationship is because we are relational creatures. And this is something that we forget. Now, this is where I think taking seriously what science has to say about compassion and its role in human experience and human nature, I think is going to be helpful. Especially those who are religious, then you don't need to be convinced that compassion is important because you kind of know it is and you believe it is. But what these new information gives is a more concrete content to the story. And that's what makes it more real, so that you can relate to your own experience and recognize when these experiences happen. So that I think is an important one. And also one of the interesting new knowledge that we are beginning to get is coming from the area of science known as science of well-being or happiness studies. And studies after study shows that one of the most important factor that predicts overall life satisfaction and happiness is really a sense of purpose. Whether the individual has a sense of purpose or not really defines to a large extent whether you have a greater sense of satisfaction in your life. Now, there's nothing more powerful than compassion to give you a sense of purpose. And we know from our own personal experience that when we have a quality relation with someone, if we are able to help someone spontaneously, it enhances us. Right there we feel bigger than ourselves. We experience joy, and we are able to step out of our narrow prison of self-interest, self-focus, and we become enlarged and enhanced. And now there are scientific studies that shows that actually when you are able to help someone, it's known as the helper's high. Literally, brain chemicals shoot up in your brain, and those chemicals are exactly the same chemicals that shoot up when you are anticipating a good chocolate. Now, it sounds weird, but because there's a kind of a joy, anticipation of a joy, and it's a sense of fulfillment. And then, of course, Thomas Jefferson talked about moral elevation. When you see someone do an altruistic act, you actually admire. This is called you become morally elevated. So I think those kind of, and in our own personal life too, for example, at a workplace, when our work is valued, we are more happy. As human beings, as William James said, one of the fundamental character of human nature is the craving for recognition. That is who we are. And even in our own family life, when we can make a difference, we feel valued. We feel that we matter. And this is all because it provides a sense of purpose, and sense of purpose enhances happiness. So these are connected. And furthermore, one of the things that is beginning to be a serious problem in the Western world is the problem of loneliness, especially as you get older. When you are young and you have family, you have a lot of things to do. But as you get older, you have less immediate responsibilities, then loneliness becomes an issue. Now, there's nothing like compassion to buffer against loneliness, because compassion allows you to step outside of yourself, and therefore compassion allows to take relationships seriously. And sometimes in order to do that, you have to make it's a bit more, you have to make some fuss, just to, in order to, sometimes it may be, you think it may be easier to just, couch on your, sofa and flip the TV on. Yeah, of course, it's easier. But if you keep doing it every day and you detach yourself from your friends and, family, then of course you're walking down a narrow path which will lead to increasing loneliness. So you have to make a fuss. Sometimes it may be annoying because you have to call someone, you have to drive and pick them up and so on and so forth. But in the end, you yourself gain from this because it enriches your relationship. And we human beings are never meant to be living always alone. We are social creatures. Now, of course, there are some monks who will choose, but then that's different. These are these are like, Olympic, gold medal athletes. Not all of us, all of us can learn, for example, like how to ski or how to play tennis. All of us can learn, but not all of us can expect that we will be standing on the podium and getting an Olympic medal. So similarly, there might be some individuals, and I know from my own Tibetan community, there are monks who choose to live a life of a hermit, alone, in the wilderness, in the mountains, and very rarely having any hot meal, and they're perfectly happy, because that's a particular calling. They choose it, and in the Christian community, they are contemplative, Carmelites, for example. They tend to live a very isolated, solitary life. There are very few individuals for whom those kind of approach will suit, but for most of us, we are social creatures, we are relational creatures, and our quality of life and happiness is to a large extent influenced by the kind of relationship that we have in our life. Then the effort has to also, you have to make the effort yourself to establish that basis for relationship. So sometimes it is annoying, but then the payoff is much greater. So I think in this case, I would particularly urge many younger people who have elderly parents in the West to make the effort, pay them visits, especially if they're in old elderly homes. And even a visit to the elderly home once a month will make a huge difference. So those kind of things, and for the person who is doing the act of kindness, it doesn't cost that much. But for the person who is receiving that act of kindness, it means a huge deal. So in these kind of situations, when you take compassion seriously, you then will understand that sometimes it may cost a little bit to you, but what the other person is gaining is massive. So in which case you do need to make that effort. And therefore, one of the things that the Buddhist tradition brings in, which is helpful, is to bring a more systematic approach to your compassion. And this is where Buddhism is quite good, because Buddhism has a long tradition of mental training, and meditation is part of that. And there, I think, taking some of the techniques of how to make it more systematic so that your compassion doesn't remain as a kind of a dormant force that only comes up when it's triggered. All of us have capacities for compassion as well as anger, but generally we tend to leave it at the mercy of a situation. When we are provoked, we get angry. When we see someone in pain, we feel for the person. So we leave it at that. We leave it at the level of response, something that is triggered by a situation. But what you would want, especially for those who take compassion seriously, is to make compassion a more active force. It's almost like a kind of a standpoint, your value from which you will relate to the world. And if you're able to do that, then it will make a complete difference, because things are always going to happen to you. This is unavoidable. I mean, this is why the Buddha said that the first fact of human existence is the reality of suffering. It doesn't really matter how famous, how wealthy, how well protected you are, so long as you are an embodied human being. The reality of sometimes not getting what you want, sometimes encountering situations that are difficult, it's going to be there. And so things are always going to happen in your life. And because we are social creatures, things that happen to us also involves other people's role. And you can never control other people's role. But where you do have a say is how you respond to that situation. There you have some say. Now, whether you respond to that challenge or difficulty or situation from a place of negative judgment, blaming everybody else, or self-pity, where you beat yourself and wallow in self-pityness, or from a place of compassion and understanding. That is up to you. And which route you choose will make all the difference. If you choose the route of self-pity, of course you're going to continue to beat yourself, and you will develop an aversive reaction to the situation, and every time you're trying to control yourself, when control is sometimes an illusion, and and the more illusion you create, the more you build up for a disappointment. That's the nature of reality. Or if you choose the route of negative judgment and anger and frustration, then of course you're going to blame the whole world. It's not my fault. The world is conspiring against me, and all of this. And then you will say, oh, nothing works for me, and all of this. And then that takes you to a different route. But if you choose the road of compassion, the first step is to be kind to yourself. And that involves accepting the reality. And accepting the reality, being kind to yourself, then opens the door to say, okay, what is the most smart thing to do here? What is the wise course to take here? Those are choices we do have. And this is where taking compassion more seriously and being more intentional about it really makes a difference. So every now and then, if you can visit your intention, connect with it, and those who are religious, compassion is an important value for you anyway. So you don't have to struggle to make it part of your value system. It's already there. But what you do need to do is to make it more active, so that that value that you take seriously has the power to affect and influence your everyday action. And in order to do that, you have to make it more conscious. You can't just leave it as taken for granted. It's there as a background. You have to make it more conscious, so that if you are, for example, sometimes I have to have difficult conversations with people because my sort of hat is in many different roles, partly because of my service to His Holiness. I've been serving him for over 30 years now. So part of that work involves mixing with so many people, and sometimes the need to have a difficult conversation. And one thing that I always find very helpful is being very intentional. And before just jumping in, taking a little time off, taking a step back, taking a deep breath, and checking my intention. What is my intention here? And what do I want to achieve here? How can I bring the best of me in this interaction? That intention setting alone really helps you maintain your composure, because you're going to be less defensive. You're going to be more open to understanding the other person's point of view, because sometimes people do silly things not because they want to annoy you. Sometimes the surface motivation may be that, but the real motivation may be because they're suffering. It's coming from a place of pain. They don't know how to do better. So being intentional in those kind of interactions and taking the time really allows you to see that. So this is what I mean by making
your value, which is compassion, a more active force. The same thing goes for parent-child relationship. I know I've now been living in the West for, almost 30 years, first in England and now in Canada. And, one thing that I notice is that parent-child relationship in the West, in the initial stage is wonderful. Western culture is much more expressive of their emotion. They always say, I love you, I love you, I love you all the time. So it's much more expressive. But at some point when the children begins to have their own individuality, then the relationship sometimes becomes a kind of a struggle for power. And then, so then in the heat of a moment, parents say nasty things to their children, and children say nasty things to their parents. So in those kind of situations, even in parent-child interaction, on the part of the parents particularly, if you can check your intention. Sometimes we tend to be harsh, we tend to respond harshly to our children's behavior because we feel that your child is not respecting you, challenging your authority. But these are your own issues. I mean, these problems have nothing to do with the kid in front of you, and we forget. But as a parent, what you would want your ultimate intention to be is child safety, especially when the children go through teenage years. They want to hang out late, and they're testing the boundaries. And then when they come home late, you're worried. And then, especially if they have a curfew which they violate, you have to tell them off. Of course, there has to be consequences. But then, why you are telling off? If you're telling off because you feel not respected, you feel that your authority is being challenged, that is a self-regarding motivation. But if your scolding and all of this is coming from a place where you are worried about the child's safety, it's coming so late and not having a trust issue, then it is about the child. And children kind of know which motivation the action is coming from. They're smart, and that changes the nature of relationship between the parents and the child. So even in a parenting, if you are able, the more you are able to bring compassion, the quality of that parenting changes. Because at the heart of compassion is the ability to connect and empathize with the person in front of you for whom you are feeling compassion. So what happens when compassion arises is three things happen very swiftly. One is the understanding and perception. Perceiving the situation can be a pain or a need. Understanding it, that's empathy. And then being emotionally moved by it, that means you care. That is an emotional component. So there is a perception, which is an understanding. There is an emotional connection, which is the empathy. And then wanting to do something about it. What can I do to help? So three things happen simultaneously, or almost simultaneously. So first, the understanding of the situation, the need. Then feeling moved by it because you care. And then third is wanting to do something about it. That in a nutshell is compassion. And we don't need to learn it from religion or classroom or a teacher. It's there naturally. But where we do need to learn a little bit is how to make that more conscious part of our everyday life and how to bring that into our everyday interaction with others so that it becomes a place from which we will view the world. How we see ourselves, how we see others in our life, how we relate to them, and how we relate to the world around us. If we can use compassion as the place from which, like the home, those who are old enough may have learned how to type properly. When you learn how to type properly, there's a home key where you're supposed to always return. Now these days, of course, everybody's doing this, and then the kids are doing this. So, of course, people don't, but I'm old enough to know that a proper typing teaching involves teaching you the home key, so that you type and then you come back to the home key. So, if you can make compassion your home key, like a home base, then In the end, human life, there is one thing that I quoted in my book actually. It's from a Tibetan teacher who says that a true test of your spiritual evolution really has to do with how you relate to your death when the final day comes. What is the state of mind going to be? If at that point you feel, yes, I've done my best, I've lived a good life, I've made a difference in other people's life, I've cared for others, I've been loved, you can leave with a kind of joy. So that's the most evolved. Now that may be, living with joy may be a tough one, but that's for the highly evolved spiritual people, that's supposed to be the case. For those in the intermediate level, you will have no regret, because you feel that you have done your bit, you have mattered, because if you had lived your life only for yourself, then at that stage there is not much to feel grateful to, because you have just lived mainly for yourself. So the second level is the one who can live without regret, without fear, so that there is no fear because you have made peace with yourself. Third, the least evolved, the Tibetan teacher said, this particular Tibetan teacher says, is that you should strive so that you can, when the time comes for you to leave, you can leave without regret. And I think this is important because in the end, human life may seem very long, 100 years or 80, 90 years. These days, the longevity is quite impressive, actually. In the old days, people were living much shorter lives. But thanks to modern medicine, and even if we take 90 years or 100 years, the time will move on. So that's human reality. And during this period, what you do in a day-to-day life, the people whose lives you have mattered and affected, and whether or not you have yourself been at the receiving end of other people's care and affection and love, that is what matters. Because if we have a conception of human life purely defined in terms of how much we are making and how big our home is and what kind of car we are driving, then it's kind of okay. Yeah, maybe from a worldly point of view, it's a mark of success. But then, it's not that to be admired about. The richness of human life really has to come from a life with meaning, purpose, and compassion. So I wanted to share these with you. And in my own life, I've been very fortunate. And it's a funny thing to say for someone who grew up as a refugee child in India. But on the other hand, the appreciation of other people's kindness and compassion, I have felt acutely as a child. I went to a refugee school, and as I was growing up in the Tibetan settlement, many of the aid sacks that we received had written very bold letter, Catholic Relief Service, and then or American Aid. There was one of the favorite one is star and stripes on the background with two hands, clasping each other like in a handshake, and it says American Aid. So that's how I grew up. So the appreciation of other people's compassion and kindness has been something that I've built into my bones. And then as I began to work in my adult years, I happened to coincidentally become His Holiness the Dalai Lama's interpreter. And of course, I had the privilege to serve him for now more than 30 years. And his central message is really compassion. He's one person who has really, more than the scientist, made the language of compassion universal. He's the one who has really, made the case that it doesn't, whether you are religious or not is up to an individual choice. But so long as you are a human being, you cannot escape the influence of compassion and kindness. So it it is in your own self-interest to take compassion seriously. So I've had the chance to, serve him, assist him in his major book projects, and also, more importantly, serving him so closely. I've had the privilege to, see him as if were from the front seat, what it feels like and what it looks like if someone were to live their life truly from a place of compassion. And I've seen him interact with so many people, and it doesn't really matter whether it is the President of the United States or the Queen of England or just an ordinary person. When he is sitting in front of you, he makes you feel complete. He makes you feel valued. He really has this ability to look into your eyes, be fully present there, and to make you feel that you are real, and that is a capacity that he has developed, cultivated, and it's wonderful to see that. And part of that is also a genuine depth of courage. He's one of the few individuals I've met in my life who is totally comfortable in his skin. There is a sense of ease that is really like almost like the stillness of an ocean. There's a kind of a strength there. And you can understand it. Why? Because he has nothing to hide. He's what you see. And his interaction, every interaction is utterly genuine, because he's operating from a place of compassion. There's a real sense of freedom in him. And I don't think he was born like this. I think he acquired it. All of us have the natural capacity, but he chose to cultivate it and live his life from this. And if he can do it, there is no reason why we can't do it. After all, he, of course, we as Tibetans, we see him as manifestation of the Buddha of compassion and all the rest. But on the other hand, he's a human being like us, who was nurtured by, happened to be, one of the lucky ones who had a very loving mother. But most of us actually have been lucky. And when we were very infant, very young child, we have received mother's care. So I think the seed is there, and when you take the example of someone like him, it is very empowering. It's very inspiring. And one thing that is particularly inspiring about the message of compassion, it's a universal truth that is at the heart of all the world's religious traditions. So you don't have to worry about whether this is Buddhism, is it too alien for me, whether it's Christianity or is something there, whether it's Hinduism. None of these resistance you need to bring. It's a human reality. And it doesn't really matter what you look like, where you come from. When it comes to the fundamental human reality, there is nothing to differentiate us. Fundamental human reality is the same everywhere. And if we are able to live our life from that place, taking compassion seriously, first beneficiary is really yourself. You stand to gain. You have a kind of a approach to life that has a sense of clarity. That's the beauty of compassion. It brings a sort of a simplicity to the complexity of life. And we see that in someone like His Holiness. Of course, as a Tibetan, I know that he carries the weight of the Tibetan people and their struggle, and enormous expectations placed upon him. But at the personal level, he is a genuinely happy man. Those who have seen him on television, you will know that he laughs very easily and very fully from his belly, There is a kind of a freedom. And although I've served him for 30 years, whenever I have the chance to sit down with him, I feel energized. I feel empowered. I feel inspired because, he is just another human being like me. If he can attain that level of serenity and joy and peace, I too can. So I think this is an important message that we all need to share. And particularly people who take religious teaching seriously, I think compassion is the way to go. really, if you structure all of your religious practices around compassion and put compassion at the core, especially those who are Christians, it is an easy thing to do because the New Testament is almost like shining the spotlight on God's merciful character. I mean, that some of the passages in the New Testament are the most, evoking, inspiring verses on compassion. So I think for the Christians particularly, it's not an alien concept. So structuring your religious life and belief and practice around compassion and putting compassion at the heart will be much more effective way of relating to your faith than making compassion only a kind of a marginal value that you evoke when you feel like. So I wanted to, and thank you for coming. And I just wanted to, I normally when I talk, I don't read, I don't prepare. Of course, I prepared my thought, and I like to speak directly from my heart. And sorry if I'm sometimes a little passionate, but it is a value that I really feel passionate about. Thank you.